guys, I'm back. My name is ISIDRO-TV and I'll be discussing utilitarianism. What if you are put into this situation, the trolley problem, and you're the person who needs to choose to divert the tram from the main track, saving 5 people on the track but killing the worker on the other track? Save 5 or save 1? It is very clear that you need to make ethical judgments. So what is an ethical judgment? Ethical judgment is a normative and prescriptive judgment on how we ought to act or what we should do, while on science it is more descriptive on point of view. On making ethical judgments, there are areas of emphasis. So these are the purpose or the motive, act, the rule or the maxim, and the results or the consequences. When using utilitarianism as a basis for ethical judgment, we are considering its or the action's result or consequences. That means that this theory emphasizes ends over means. Since this theory emphasizes the results or the consequences, therefore it can be considered as one of the theories under teleological or consequentialist theory of ethics. Well, that is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. According to Jeremy Bentham's formulation of utilitarianism, man is under 2 great masters, and that is pain and pleasure. Whereas the good, or the great good, that we should seek is happiness, which is also known as a hedonistic perspective, and those actions whose results increase happiness or diminish pain are good, so they have utility or the usefulness of the consequences. Otherwise, it is evil or wrong. And of course, in determining the quantity of happiness that might be produced by an action, we evaluate the possible consequences by applying several values which he called hedonistic calculus or philosophic calculus. In identifying the quantity or the quality of happiness, we need to identify its intensity or the intensity of happiness, the duration of happiness, the certainty or uncertainty of happiness after the action, the propinquity or the remoteness of the action, or the closeness to the person who is involved, fecundity or the chance that the action follows the same kind of sensation, purity and extent of happiness. These are the things that we need to consider in identifying the quantity and the quality of happiness under hedonistic calculus of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. There are 4 researchers or theses of utilitarianism that we need to consider. So we have consequentialism, hedonism, maximalism, and universalism. In consequentialism, of course, the rightness of actions is determined solely by their consequences. In hedonism, utility or the usefulness of consequences is the degree to which an act produces pleasure. Hedonism is the thesis that pleasure or happiness is the good that we seek and that we should seek. Maximalism, on the other hand, is a right action produces the greatest good consequences and the least bad. In universalism, the consequences to be considered are those of everyone affected and everyone equally. Which of this do you want to believe? Consequentialism, hedonism, maximalism, or universalism? There are 2 formulations of utilitarian theory. One is the principle of utility and the other is the greatest happiness. In principle of utility, the best action is that which produces the greatest happiness or and reduces pain. While on greatest happiness, we ought to do that which produces the greatest happiness and least pain for the greatest number of people. Therefore, in utilitarian theory, there should be the principle of utility or the greatest happiness or what reduces pain, and the greatest happiness should be also based on the greatest number of people. Without these two formulations, there will be no utilitarianism. There are two types of utilitarianism. One is the act utilitarianism, and two is the rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is proposed by Jeremy Bentham, and rule utilitarianism is proposed by John Stuart Mill. According to the act utilitarianism, it argues that an action is right if and only if it produces the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for the greatest number. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, by John Stuart Mill, states that an action is right if and only if it conforms to a set of rules, the general acceptance of which would produce the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for the greatest number. So therefore, as you can see, the difference between the act and the rule utilitarianism is that act is based upon only on the greatest number of people, while in rule utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, it is based on the rules which are generally accepted by the greatest number of people. Bentham's utilitarianism is focused only and solely to the act, and the John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism is focused solely on the rules set by the general or the greatest number of people. For example, you attempt to help an elderly man across the street. He gets across safely. So the conclusion is the act was a good act. But you attempt, for example, to help an elderly man across the street. You stumble as you go, he is knocked into the path of a car and is hurt. The conclusion in the act is, of course, a bad act, because the result was bad. If you can use 80 soldiers as a decoy in a war, and thereby attack an enemy force and kill several hundred enemy soldiers, that is a morally good choice, even though the 80 might be lost. And if lying or stealing will actually bring about more happiness and or reduce pain, act utilitarianism says we should lie and steal in those cases. Another example is the decision at Coventry during World War II, where the decision was made not to inform the town that they would be bombed, or war tactic. And also the Ford Pinto case, where a defective vehicle would sometimes explode when hit. So the model was not recalled and repaired by Ford because they felt it was cheaper to pay the liability suits than to recall and repair all the defective cars. Well, of course, in every theory, there is always criticism. So, one of the criticisms of Bentham's theory of utilitarianism is that the theory of Bentham could mean that if 10 people would be happy watching a man being eaten by wild dogs, it would be a morally good thing for the 10 men to kidnap someone, especially someone whose death would not cause grief to many others, and throw the man into a cage of wild, hungry dogs. As utilitarianism as a theory of ethics continued to spread, and evolved, John Stuart Mill adjusted utilitarianism. Mill argues that we must consider the quality of the happiness, not merely the quantity. For example, some might find happiness with a pitcher of beer and a pizza. Others may find happiness watching a fine Shakespearean play. The quality of happiness is greater with the latter, because for him it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Therefore, Mill asserts only that the quality of happiness is based on reason, because human beings are made to have reason. Again, in Mill's quality arguments, as between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial or equal as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. And in the Golden Rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility, and that is to do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself. It constitutes the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality, that is based in fairness and equality. Of course, there is also criticism of this utilitarianism. So, if I am to bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number, not putting my own happiness above others, that may lead to a dilemma. I live in a neighborhood where 83% of my neighbors use drugs. I could make them most happy by helping supply them with cheap drugs, but I feel uncomfortable doing that. What should a utilitarian do? What you should do. Bernard Williams criticizes the implied doctrine of negative responsibility in utilitarianism. For example, a thug breaks into my home and holds 6 people hostage, telling us he will kill all of us. However, the thug says, "If you will kill 2 of your family, I will let you and the other 3 live." With utilitarianism, the good thing to do is to kill 2 members of my family. What will you do? Well, that is a doctrine of negative responsibility. Utilitarianism plays fast and loose with God's commandments. If lying, stealing, or killing could lead to an increase of happiness for the greatest number, we are told we should lie, steal, or kill. Isn't that a rejection of God's commandment? Well, that is like a godless theory of criticism. Well, John Stuart Mill answers this godless theory criticism. He questioned the nature of God. Does God make arbitrary rules just to see if we will obey? Or does God make rules that He knows will lead to our happiness? And if the latter statement is true, doesn't it make sense God would want us to use our God-given reason to look at the situation? He asserts that the reason that was God-given is a tool that we can use in any situation, considering utilitarianism. If it be a true belief that God desires, above all things, the happiness of His creatures, and that this was His purpose in their creation, utility is not a godless doctrine, but more profoundly religious than any other. He also said that whatever God has thought fit to reveal on the subject of morals must fulfill the requirements of utility in a supreme degree, and that degree would be coming from man's reason. The second criticism of utilitarianism: if one must decide the probable outcome of an act before knowing whether it is good or bad, how can children learn to evaluate acts, since they know so little of what consequences might arise from their actions? This criticism asserts that children lacked the reason to understand the consequences of their actions. Well, under Mill's rule utilitarianism, mankind must by this time have acquired positive beliefs as to the effects of some actions on their happiness, and the beliefs which have thus come down are the rules of morality for the multitude and for the philosopher until he has succeeded in finding better. Mill concludes also, however, that we should always seek improvements. When it comes to rights and utilitarianism, many philosophers hold that we have certain rights, either from God, nature, or from a social contract. Well, can the idea of rights be made compatible with utilitarianism? If ignoring rights brings about more happiness to the greatest number, should we ignore the so-called rights? Mill's rule-based view on liberty, having a right to liberty will bring the greatest happiness. Well, it is very clear that happiness can't be answered by only one philosopher. Utilitarianism can't be answered by only one philosopher. Ethics can't be answered by just one philosopher. The definition of God, or the nature of God, the nature of human rights and other things, those cannot be answered by just one answer. So my last question for you guys is, what is the greatest happiness?